Keanu Reeves cruised through the quiet streets of Los Angeles on his motorcycle, the cold night air biting at his leather jacket. Under a flickering street lamp he spotted a frail, homeless woman huddled in tattered blankets, a sight all too common in this city of contrasts. But when he stopped and saw her face, time froze. It was Mrs. Elena Harper, the teacher who'd once ignited his passion for acting. What happened next? A chase, a confrontation, and an act of kindness would shock a community and change her life forever. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, drop a comment with your city or country. Where are you watching from? If you love heartfelt tales like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we've got another jaw-dropping story waiting for you. It was a cold night in Los Angeles when Keanu Reeves found himself riding his motorcycle through the city's quieter streets. The hum of the engine was a steady companion, cutting through the chill that hung in the air. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just riding, letting the rhythm of the road clear his mind. But then he saw her. A frail figure sat hunched against a building, wrapped in tattered blankets that barely clung to her thin frame. At first she was just another shadow on the sidewalk, one of too many in a city where wealth and struggle lived side by side. Keanu almost kept going. He'd seen this before, too often really, and the weight of it always lingered, but something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the way she sat, knees drawn up tight, or the slump of her shoulders that screamed defeat. His gut told him to stop. He slowed the bike, the engine's growl softening as he pulled over. The street lamp above cast a faint glow, barely enough to see by, but it was enough. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer. The face peering out from the blankets was worn and hollow, etched with lines of hardship, but unmistakable. Mrs. Elena Harper, his high school theater teacher, the woman who'd once stood tall and commanding in front of a classroom, her voice ringing with passion, now sat broken on the pavement. His mind reeled. How could this be her? He hadn't seen her in years, but the recognition hit him like a punch. This wasn't just any teacher. This was the one who'd changed everything for him. Keanu's thoughts drifted back to those early days. He'd been a lanky, awkward kid then, more comfortable disappearing into the background than standing out. Acting terrified him. Standing on a stage, all eyes on him, felt like stepping into a fire. But Mrs. Harper saw something he didn't. She'd call him out in class, her sharp eyes cutting through his slouch. "You've got it, Keanu," she'd say, her tone firm but warm. "Stop hiding it." She'd pushed him into improv exercises, ridiculous scenes that made him stumble over his words at first, until one day it clicked, the fear faded and he found his voice. She'd been there, clapping from the front row at his first real performance, a proud smile on her face. She'd believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself. And now, here she was, alone, forgotten, a ghost of the woman he'd known. He swung his leg off the bike and crouched down, hesitant. "Mrs. Harper?" His voice came out softer than he meant, almost swallowed by the night. For a moment, she didn't move, her head bowed as if she hadn't heard. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes were cloudy, distant, like she'd been staring through the world for too long. She blinked, trying to focus, and Keanu watched as a flicker of something, recognition, crossed her face. "Kiana?" Her voice was a rasp, thin and cracked, barely above a whisper. He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Yeah, it's me." She exhaled shakily, her hands clutching the frayed edges of her blanket. I didn't think I'd see you again." Her words trembled and Keanu felt his chest tighten. He'd imagined running into her someday, maybe at a play or a random coffee shop, trading stories about the old days. Never like this. "What happened?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted the answer. She looked away, her fingers twisting the fabric in her lap. "Life," she said simply, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "It just happened." He waited, sensing there was more. After a long pause, she sighed. "The school cut the theater program years ago. I thought I'd find something else, teaching, coaching, anything. But it didn't work out. Rent went up, jobs dried up, and I ended up here." She gestured vaguely at the sidewalk, a bitter edge to her tone. "I tried to keep going, but it wasn't enough." Keanu swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just a fall, it was a collapse, piece by piece, until the woman who'd once shaped his future had nothing left. He studied her, the proud posture he remembered now bent, her bright eyes dulled by years of struggle. "You're still you," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. She let out a small, humorless laugh. "Am I? I don't even know anymore." The raw honesty in her voice cut through him. He couldn't just leave her here, not like this, not her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his tone firm. She looked up at him then, really looked, and for the first time that night, something shifted in her expression. It wasn't hope, not yet, but maybe the memory of it. Keanu knelt there, rooted to the spot, knowing this moment was only the beginning. Keanu knelt beside Mrs. Elena Harper, still reeling from the sight of her on the cold Los Angeles sidewalk. The air between them hung heavy with her quiet confession, years of loss piling up until she'd landed here. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, when a sudden blur of movement cut through the silence. A figure darted from the shadows, fast and deliberate, lunging toward Mrs. Harper. Before Keanu could react, the man's hands snatched the small, tattered bag she'd been clutching, a pitiful bundle of her last possessions. "Hey!" Keanu shouted, springing to his feet as the thief bolted down the street. Instinct took over. Keanu sprinted after him, his boots pounding the pavement, adrenaline surging through his veins. The guy was quick, weaving through the narrow alley beside the building, but Keanu was faster. He closed the gap, lunging forward to grab the man's arm just as he rounded a corner. The thief stumbled, the bag slipping from his grip, and Keanu yanked it back with a sharp tug. "Drop it and go," Keanu growled. His voice low but firm. The man twisted around, his face half hidden under a hood, eyes wild with desperation. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, wrenching free. "I'll be back for her, you'll see." With that, he vanished into the dark, leaving Keanu standing there, chest heaving, the bag clutched in his hands. He jogged back to Mrs. Harper, who hadn't moved, her frail form still hunched against the wall. "You okay?" he asked, dropping to one knee and holding out the bag. She nodded faintly, her hands trembling as she took it. "That's all I've got left," she whispered, clutching it to her chest. Keanu's jaw tightened. The threat lingered in his mind. "I'll be back for her." And he knew this spot wasn't safe anymore. He shrugged off his leather jacket, the night's chill biting into him as he draped it over her shoulders. "Come on," he said gently, "we're getting out of here." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt, but the weight of the jacket and the firmness in his voice seemed to nudge her forward. Keanu helped her up, steadying her as they walked to his motorcycle. He drove them a few blocks to a small, dimly lit cafe, one of those late-night spots that never seemed to close. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and warm bread, a stark contrast to the cold street. He guided her to a corner booth, sliding in across from her as she sank into the seat, still wrapped in his jacket. A waitress brought 2 steaming mugs, and Keanu pushed one toward her. "Drink," he said. "It'll help." Mrs. Harper stared at the mug, her fingers curling around it but not lifting it. The silence stretched until she finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want it to come to this." Keanu leaned forward, elbows on the table, waiting. She sighed, her gaze dropping. "After the theater program got cut, I tried to keep going, odd jobs, tutoring, whatever I could find. But it wasn't enough. My son James, he offered to help, wanted me to move in with him and his family." She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I said no." "Why?" Keanu asked, keeping his tone soft. She shook her head, a flicker of shame crossing her face. "I was ashamed. I'd spent my whole life teaching kids to stand on their own, to chase their dreams. How could I let him see me like that? Weak, broken. I told myself I'd figure it out, that I didn't need anyone. But every time he called, I pushed him away. Eventually he stopped calling." Her voice cracked and she looked down, her hands tightening around the mug. "I pushed them all away. My son, my daughter-in-law, my grandkids. I thought I was protecting them from my mess." Keanu's chest ached at her words. He could hear the regret, the weight of choices she couldn't take back. "You didn't want to be a burden," he said quietly. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "But all I did was make it worse. Now they don't even know where I am." The rawness in her admission hung between them, and Keanu felt a surge of resolve. He couldn't fix the past, but he could do something now. He reached across the table, resting a hand lightly on hers. "What happened out there? That guy coming after you, it's not safe. And you don't have to keep doing this alone. She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face. Keanu, I don't want your pity. He shook his head, his voice steady. This isn't pity. You gave me something back then. Confidence. A chance. When I didn't think I deserved it. Let me give something back to you. It's not charity. It's what's right. She studied him, her expression wavering between doubt and a fragile glimmer of trust. I don't even know where to start, she admitted. You don't have to, he said. Just let me help you take the first step. For a moment she said nothing, the hum of the cafe filling the silence. Then, slowly, she nodded. It was small, hesitant, but it was enough. Keanu leaned back, determination settling in. He wasn't walking away, not from her, not from this. Whatever it took, he'd see her through. Keanu sat across from Mrs. Elena Harper in the quiet cafe, the steam from their untouched coffee curling into the air. Her confession about pushing her family away lingered between them, heavy and raw. He couldn't shake the image of her out there alone, or the thief's threat still echoing in his ears. She needed more than a warm drink. She needed a way out. What about James? Keanu asked, breaking the silence. Your son, maybe he could... She cut him off with a sharp shake of her head, her voice trembling. No, he won't want anything to do with me. Keanu frowned, leaning forward. You don't know that. She let out a bitter laugh, wiping at her eyes. I do. I made sure of it. He waited, sensing she needed to let it out. She sighed, her hands fidgeting with the mug. After I turned him down, over and over, he kept trying. Calls, letters, even showed up at my apartment once. But I shut him out, told him I didn't need him hovering over me like I was some helpless old woman. The last time we talked, he said I was selfish, that I didn't care how it hurt him or his kids. He was right. Her voice broke and she pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over. Keanu's chest tightened. He could hear the pain in her words, the kind that came from years of regret piling up. Let me call him, he said gently, just to see where he's at. She looked up, panic flashing in her eyes. Keanu, no, I can't face that. But he was already pulling out his phone, his resolve firm. You don't have to. I'll handle it. He stepped away from the table, dialing the number she reluctantly gave him after a long pause. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Yeah? James Harper? Keanu asked. This is Keanu Reeves. I'm with your mom. A tense silence followed, then James's tone turned cold. What's this about? Keanu kept it simple. I found her on the street. She's been homeless. I'm trying to help her get back on her feet. James let out a harsh laugh. Good luck with that. She didn't want my help when I offered it. Over and over, she made it clear she doesn't need anyone. Why should I care now? Keanu gripped the phone tighter. Because she's your mom, and she's not okay. James's voice hardened. She stopped being my mom when she cut us out. My kids don't even remember her face. I'm done chasing someone who doesn't want to be found. Before Keanu could respond, the line went dead. He stood there, staring at the screen, frustration simmering under his skin. He walked back to the booth, where Mrs. Harper sat watching him, her expression a mix of dread and resignation. He doesn't want to help, Keanu said, sliding into the seat. He's angry, hurt. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I knew it. I ruined everything. There's no fixing this. Keanu reached across, resting a hand on hers. You made mistakes, so did he, but it's not over unless you let it be. She pulled her hand back, shaking her head. You don't get it, Keanu. I don't deserve a second chance, not after what I did to them. Her sobs came harder now and Keanu felt a pang of helplessness, but he wasn't giving up. You can't stay out there, he said, his voice steady. Not after tonight. There's a place, a support center. It's not just a shelter. They help people start over. Housing, jobs, counseling. Let me take you there. She looked up, her eyes red and wary. A shelter? Keanu, I can't be one of those people. He leaned in, holding her gaze. You're not those people. You're Elena Harper, the woman who taught me to face my fears. This isn't the end of your story. It's a step. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of his jacket. What if they judge me? What if I don't fit? Her voice was small, fragile. Keanu softened his tone. They won't. And you don't have to fit, just show up. I'll be with you, one step at a time. She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally she nodded, a tiny, reluctant agreement. He stood, offering his hand, and she took it, her grip shaky but real. The ride to the support center was quiet, the city blurring past as Keanu drove. Mrs. Harper sat behind him, clinging to his waist, her doubts loud in her silence. When they arrived, the building loomed ahead, modest but warm, its lights a soft beacon against the night. Inside, a receptionist greeted them with a kind smile, handing Mrs. Harper a clipboard. "Take your time," the woman said. "We'll get you settled." Mrs. Harper clutched the forms, her hands trembling as she sat in the waiting area. Keanu stayed close, watching as she filled them out, her pen moving slowly at first, then steadier. She glanced at him, a flicker of something, maybe gratitude, crossing her face. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "You're already doing it," he replied, and for the first time that night, she didn't argue. She was opening up, just a crack, but it was a start. The support center was a quiet refuge, its walls lined with simple furniture and a faint smell of coffee in the air. Mrs. Elena Harper sat in the waiting area, her hands still trembling as she finished the intake forms. Keanu stayed by her side, his presence steady and reassuring. A staff member soon approached, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Harper, we've got a room ready for you. You'll have some privacy tonight and we'll talk options tomorrow." Elena nodded, gripping the chair as she stood, and Keanu gave her an encouraging smile. "This is good," he said. She glanced back at him, hesitant but grateful, before following the woman down the hall. For the first time in years, she had a place to rest. But the peace didn't last long. The next morning, as Keanu returned to check on her, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. A small group of people, other residents and a couple of staff, huddled near the lounge, their whispers sharp and pointed. He caught his name in the mix, and then hers. "That's Keanu Reeves," one woman muttered, her tone skeptical. "Probably just here for the cameras," another chimed in louder. "Yeah, helping some old lady to look good. Classic Hollywood move." Keanu froze, his jaw tightening. He hadn't told anyone who he was, but word had spread anyway, twisting his intentions into something cheap. Mrs. Harper overheard it too. She'd been sitting quietly in the common area, flipping through a pamphlet when the comments reached her. Her face paled and she shrank into herself, clutching Keanu's jacket tighter. He crossed the room to her, ignoring the stares. "They think you're just using me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they're right? What if I'm dragging you down?" Keanu knelt in front of her, his eyes locking with hers. "They're wrong. I'm here because I want to be. Because you matter. Not for some headline." She shook her head, doubt clouding her gaze. "Keanu, you've got a life, a career. You don't need this." "Me? Hanging over you." He leaned closer, his voice firm but kind. "Listen to me. Back then, you saw something in me when I was a scared kid with no direction. You didn't care what anyone thought, you helped me anyway. This isn't about my image, it's about you, about what's real." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not walking away." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased and she nodded, a fragile trust taking root. The rumors faded over the next few days, overshadowed by the center's rhythm of routine and support. Mrs. Harper settled in, hesitant at first, keeping to herself as staff offered counseling and job leads. But something shifted when a coordinator, a warm woman named Lisa, approached her one afternoon. "Heard you used to teach theater," Lisa said, sitting beside her. Elena blinked, caught off guard. "Keanu mentioned it," Lisa added with a smile. "We've got a program with the community center, kids who could use someone like you. Interested?" Elena hesitated, old fears whispering she wasn't good enough anymore, but Lisa's quiet encouragement nudged her forward. "I'll think about it," she said. Weeks turned into months, and Mrs. Harper found herself standing in a small theater space at the community center. A group of kids, scrappy, loud, and full of energy, sat in a semicircle, eyeing her curiously. She started teaching them, first with simple games, then lines from old plays. The spark she'd lost flickered back to life. She wrote to James, too, pouring her apologies into letters she wasn't sure he'd read. To her surprise, he wrote back. Short, guarded replies at first, then longer ones. "The kids miss you," he admitted in one. "I do too." The words mended something broken in her, piece by piece. One evening, the theater buzzed with excitement. The kids were staging their first performance, a short, messy rendition of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Mrs. Harper adjusted costumes and coached lines, her voice steady and sure. Keanu slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. He'd kept in touch, dropping by when he could, but tonight was different. He watched her move with purpose, her eyes bright again, the woman he remembered emerging from the shadows. The kids stumbled through their parts, but their enthusiasm filled the room, and when the final line landed, the small audience, parents, volunteers, erupted in applause. Mrs. Harper stood at the edge of the stage, her hands clasped, a rare smile breaking through. She caught Keanu's eye and waved him over. "You made this happen," she said as he approached. He shook his head. "No, you did." She looked at the kids, then back at him, her expression soft. "I'm starting to believe that." Keanu grinned, seeing the change in her. Not just survival, but life. She was teaching again, healing with her son, and standing taller than she had in years. He'd given her a push, but she'd taken the leap, and that, he knew, was the real victory. This story isn't just about Keanu Reeves or Mrs. Elena Harper. It's about the power of compassion and second chances. It teaches us that no one is too far gone to be lifted up, and that kindness can ripple outward, healing wounds we didn't even know existed. Keanu didn't just save Elena, she reminded him of life's simple joys, proving that giving and receiving go hand in hand. In our own lives, it's a call to pause, to see the people around us, the ones struggling, the ones we've lost touch with, and offer a hand. You never know whose life you might change or how they might change yours. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. Your support means everything. Drop a comment. What's a moment of kindness you've seen or shared? Hit like, subscribe, and let's keep spreading the good stuff together.